Howdy folks, this is Big Sam. You know, I've been looking at military surplus rifles for a really long time now, probably going on at least 15 years. And I tell you what, pretty much all of them seem to keep going up in value, some of them faster than others, but if you look 10 or 15 years ago, most guns were a lot cheaper back then. In particular, we're talking about military surplus rifles. Now, there's a couple reasons for this that I want to get into, but the point of today's video I want to talk about is a particular rifle that right now is a really undervalued gun and has the potential to be a fantastic investment over the next 5 to 10 years, okay, which is this rifle here. But before we get into this, I want to talk a little bit about some of the price hikes we've seen over the last 5, 10, 15 years in military surplus rifles. Now, obviously, the price of most guns have gone up, okay? Now, over time, it is possible for maybe a short period of time, over the course of a few years, it's possible for the prices of at least new guns to go down, even in some cases surplus guns to go down. Why is that? Well, it can get to a point where a manufacturer of new firearms, for instance, is able to basically cut their costs of production, make it so that it costs a little bit less and it's a little more efficient to produce their guns. That can translate into a lower market price over time. It's possible. Sometimes this happens. Now, in the case of surplus firearms, occasionally you can see the price of surplus firearms go down, but it's not really what we'd call normal. It's all about supply and demand, okay? So let's say you've got a bunch of rifles and over, let's say about $500 is the going rate, okay? Maybe, let's say Carcanos. We'll use Carcanos as an example. Now, if you have a bunch of Carcanos laying around for $500 and that's the going rate, the price can go down if a whole bunch more suddenly get imported, right? The demand hasn't really changed, but immediately the supply has gone way up. So in order for that, for you to actually still sell Carcanos, now you got a ton more, you're going to have to start selling them at a lower price. Sometimes this happens, but again, it's not super common because here in America, we don't see a ton of these huge bulk imports at one time anymore like we did from, the 1960s to the 90s, early 2000s. We just don't really see that anymore. We get them in waves occasionally, but now for the most part, the prices generally stay the same or just go up. Carcanos, generally right now, they're staying about the same, but the price of Mosins and really most surplus rifles have just kept going up, okay? Now, again, it is possible for the supply to increase, and this is something you have to be cautious for, not just in guns or collectible firearms, but really anything in general. If you're looking at investing in something that has a fixed supply, you need to be concerned about if that supply could drastically increase over the near future, however the course of the term you're looking to invest in. If you think that there's a chance the supply could double or triple over the next few years, might be a good time to just wait for that supply to increase and the price will go down. They're certainly not going to go up. Okay, that is not really the case with most surplus rifles. Now, in particular today, we're talking about Mosins, and in particular this rifle, which is not your standard Mosin. What is this? Well, our subscribers will note that in particular right now it is Dragoon Week. So, of course, we're talking about a Mosin Nagant Dragoon rifle. Okay, now in comparison to Mosins, where does this stack up in collectability or price? Well, to understand that, let's first of all take a look at the most common Mosins on the market right now, which would be the 9130 rifle, used throughout World War II and afterwards, still in use today in Ukraine and some other countries, in Syria. They made millions of these things. Okay, 9130s are very common rifles. and we're talking about the supply of Mosins, okay? Now, there's some places Mosins are not common at all, but we're talking about as a whole of the market segment of Mosins and where they're available, the 9130 is by far the most common rifle. In places like here in the US and Canada, Mosins are, the 9130 rifles especially, very common rifles, easily attainable. Now, a lot of people look down on them, and have historically looked down on them for a couple reasons. One, people look at it and say, oh, that's that old junky Russian rifle. Well, not as many people look at them that way, because these are very robust rifles. The quality is there from like a build quality perspective. As long as the tolerances are good, which they should be, but it's always good to have a gunsmith check them out. These are very strong guns, and like if they're mechanically all fine, you should have any trouble with them. They tend to not be that sketchy to shoot. Okay, so that's not really they're very finicky guns, and they're built to a price point they're built to a point from a perspective of price and speed of production, right? They had to build these in the millions for people that needed a gun that worked, but they didn't need the nicest gun in the world from a fit and finish perspective and feature perspective. These are good rifles overall, and you can still get ammo for them, which is great. That really helps with the market value of these rifles. As long as you can get ammo for them, well, that's really going to add to the collectability. One of the reasons we've seen these go up. Now, another reason people look down on these is because they used to be so cheap, which is interesting, because I guess depending on who you are, you might either look down on it if it's really cheap, or you might say, oh, that's a really great price, that's an awesome buy, and then you might look up to it. Depends on who you are. These guns used to be really cheap, and you all know this. You either were there when these guns were like $50, or you've heard the stories about when these guns were imported, you could get them for $50 US. Okay? Really cheap guns they were. And that goes for really most Mosins, because right when these were flooded, there were some rarer Mosins that were sort of flooded in with the more common Mosins, and those were a little bit more expensive, but not always. A lot of times you could get, I have a family member that back in the day bought a Finish M39 for about $45. That's pretty cheap, because it's worth about close to 20 times that now, which is just insane, because this wasn't all that long ago. It was probably in my lifetime. So 20 times price increase is really good. Not super typical, not something you would expect to see with most guns. And I'm not saying you would see that with this particular gun. But we know that we went from like $50 9130s to today in 2022, where 9130s tend to be about $500, $600, maybe even a little bit more, or maybe cheaper. It just depends on where you're looking, because these guns are so common that you can find them in a lot of places for decent prices, $300-$400, and in a lot of places they're $500-$600, and there's really not much difference in the guns. Just something you have to be careful of. But the prices are widely vary. Generally, though, they're going up, and in the next few years, really, you should expect to see those around $500 to $600 at least. But again, who knows? Because we're experiencing the mass atrocity of inflation right now, kind of all around the world. Here in America, last time I checked, inflation was about 8.6%, which is not really good. Now, why is this important in regards to any sort of military rifle? Well, if inflation's 8.6% year over year, that means if you want a Mosin now, it'll be 8.6% more next year. So if you just have money sitting in the bank and you're going to want to buy one of these here, you're looking for one of these or thinking about getting one of these. If inflation's 8%, you should get one of these now, because if you wait, it's just going to cost you more money for no reason, right? The money in your bank account is slowly losing its value, okay? That's not really good. So guns like this can certainly help protect you from inflation, and I'm not saying this is the best way to help protect from inflation, but as you know, all the prices rise with inflation. The prices of these rise. That's one of the reasons these guys go up in price, is because of inflation. Okay, that's just how currency works. You have more currency, and if you have a fixed supply of these guys, well, the price is going to keep going up with that. But there's also this thing about supply and demand, and I know I'm on a rant. I appreciate y'all bearing with me. We're going to get into the dragoonness here in a second. The dragoonness. Maybe I should coin that word. Y'all know I really like my Paul Harrell type rants, so we're going to get into this, and I appreciate y'all's patience, but I really do enjoy talking about some of these supply and demand things and how they impact firearms, because it's kind of important. But anyway, if you have a fixed supply of Mosins, right? So let's say there's 100,000 Mosins in the market, let's say in America, okay? And let's say that there's 20,000 people that want to buy a Mosin, okay? Well, that's for every person, there's 5 potential Mosins they could buy, right? So the supply is much bigger than the demand. But the problem is the way humans tend to populate the earth, they tend to populate it in exponential growth. They tend to. But at this point in the import scene, we don't see the market supply of Mosins rising exponentially. What does this mean? Well, let's say over time you have exponential growth. You still have, let's say in 50 years from now, you still have those 100,000 Mosins, okay? But now let's just throw out a number. You went from 20,000 people wanting Mosins to now you have 200,000 people wanting Mosins. Because as more people populate the earth, there's more people, there's a higher probability that somebody's going to want a Mosin, right? This makes sense. Okay, so we went from 20,000 people wanting to buy a quantity of 100,000 Mosins to now 200,000 people wanting to buy a quantity of 100,000 Mosins. Okay, well, what's that going to do to the price? It's going to drive it up, okay? That's one of the reasons that military surplus rifles prices are increasing. You have a relatively fixed supply. So again, we still see some imports, but it's very slow. But the rate at which we're having more and more people being born and growing up, and then once they get to adulthood realize they want one of these rifles, well, that number is rising way faster than the number of actual rifles, okay? So that's going to inflate the prices. So couple that with 8.6% inflation right now, just on that alone, that's all you need to know. You don't need to know anything else about rarity or a whole lot else. Just from those facts, basic economics, which I don't know if they even teach in public schools these days, but you learned it here on the Big Sam channel. Okay, basic economics tells us this is actually a decent investment, because we know the price of this is most likely going to go up, because we're not really expecting to see a ton more imports of rifles like these. I would say it's very safe to say the majority of rifles like this that will be imported to America have already been imported into America. Okay, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, I appreciate y'all bearing with my epic rant here about the economy and Mosins and economics in general, but it is Dragoon Week, so we need to talk about our Dragoon rifle here. Okay, now I started on a little bit about this with the 9130 rifle, then we kind of went down on a tangent. This is a lot less common than a 9130 rifle, okay? How much less common is a Dragoon versus a 9130 rifle? Well, these rifles really aren't that well known, which should already tell you something. Most people would look at this and say, oh, this is a 9130 rifle, because the stocks are interchangeable, the barrel length is the same, handguards are the same. The only real difference is the rear sight, and a lot of people just overlook it, and it's very understandable, especially if you're not familiar with Mosins. But that rear sight really makes all the difference in the world, because that tells you that this is a rare rifle. Now, why is that? Well, they've actually made a decent amount of Dragoons. Not as much as 9130 rifles, okay? But a lot of these rifles, probably after World War II, were retrofitted to 9130 rifles by changing out the rear sight. Maybe you've heard of those rifles. They are called XDragoons. They're basically this rifle with a 9130 rear sight and a hooded front sight post, which this one has the kind of the standard Dragoon style front sight post. So most of them were retrofitted into the common pattern, okay, the 9130 pattern. So that tells us that theoretically these should be pretty uncommon then, because most of these were converted. But like, how many of these are still around? Well, that's a really good question. When we're talking about Dragoon rifles, here in America, my experience has been that roughly 70% of the Dragoon rifles you'll find for sale came from Finland, okay? So people are going to have different opinions on this, but I can just tell y'all my experience from the rifles that I've seen come on the market for sale. Let's say about 70% of Dragoons that come up for sale are from Finland, at least here in America. But I don't think Dragoons are very common anywhere else, just because there aren't all that Mosins for sale anywhere else compared to, like, say, the United States or Canada. But 70%, okay, 70% of what number, though, of how many Dragoons? Well, it's not a lot, as it turns out. Okay, so from what we know, after the World War II and everything, Finland took inventory of their Dragoon rifles, and in the 1950s, it seems like they had about, I don't know, 10, 15, 20,000 of these rifles. That is not a lot of rifles, especially when you consider how many 9130 rifles there are circulating the world. That's, 10 or 20,000 rifles is not that much. And apparently even less than that actually were still fit for combat. So we're not talking about a lot of rifles here. Well, eventually Finland exported most of those rifles probably to US and Canada. So we're talking about 10 to 15,000 Dragoon rifles they exported worldwide. Most of those probably went to the United States and Canada. So 10 to 15,000 Dragoon rifles total, and 70% of the entire market we see is probably from that pool. Okay, so that really what that tells us is there's not a lot of these floating around. If you find one of these, pay attention, because these are, I wouldn't necessarily say hen's teeth. You can find these, but I don't think people appreciate how uncommon these Dragoon rifles are. Now, they made these from 1893 all the way up until about 1931, and most of them are going to be produced by the Ijev's factory. The Tula factory did produce some after World War I and before World War II. And, some of the years will be a little more common than others, but I wouldn't say that any particular year is common necessarily. Really, what it boils down to here is if you can find your Dragoon, you probably need to just buy it outright, okay? And why is that? Well, a lot of it comes down to the current market price of these rifles. This is really where we're going to get into it, folks. Remember how I said that here in America, the 9130 rifles are trending right now at about $500 to $600, roughly, give or take. Could be a few hundred more, could be a few hundred less if you can find a good deal. But let's say about $550, okay, for a standard 9130 rifle these days. Kind of sounds like a lot, honestly, but seems like that's not a totally unexpected price to pay for something like that. Okay, so $550. What are these going for? Well, typically when I see one of these sell, I would expect it just to, like a normal Dragoon if I didn't know much about it. I know it's a Dragoon. My guesstimate would, based off of what I've seen, let's say in the last year, maybe about $800. Okay, so that's not that big of a difference, okay? If we said maybe $600 some 9130s sell for, and we're seeing Dragoons like this sell for maybe $200 more, that's like a third of the price more. It's like 30% more or something like that. Okay. That is kind of egregious when you think about it, considering how much less common these rifles are than the standard 9130 rifles. Now, why are these not that much more expensive? Well, I think a lot of it boils down to the fact that not that many people understand the difference, that understand that there is a difference, or understand just how uncommon these rifles are. This is one of the reasons why I like making videos like this, and we make a lot of videos on this channel just to help spread the word, spread the knowledge about Mosin Nagant rifles, because there's so many different variants, and if you pay attention to a lot of the videos and weapons we talk about here and Mosin Nagant variants, you'll probably have a good idea by now of what some really good buys are, like this one. If you can get this for $200 more than a standard 9130 rifle, I would say buy it. Just buy it. This is a much, I would say this, for the money, this is a much better deal than a 9130 is right now. Now, even if you could get a 9130 for like $300, it really depends on what you want, but let's say $300 to $400, this is about double that. It depends on what you're looking for, but I would still highly suggest going for one of these. These are probably one of the best buys in the Mosin Nagant realm right now from a price perspective, because a lot of the other finished guns have gotten pretty expensive, like the M39s, the M27s. M27s are a pretty good deal right now, and I think maybe we should have to do another video later after Dragoon Week, but since it's Dragoon Week, we got to focus on these rifles. I can't stress enough, though, that these are a really good buy, and, you know, $800, I tell you what, 5 to 10 years from now, I just don't see any way that these are still going to be $800. These guns are just not very appreciated, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we're having Dragoon Week. Because if you watched our last video, we went through some really interesting details of people in history that used rifles like this, and they weren't just Dragoons. All sorts of interesting people, including the famous Women's Battalion of Death, used Dragoon rifles just like this one. These guns are a really important part of history, of the early, not very well-known Mosin history. This guy is actually from 1903, so this one's 119 years old. If you can get a rifle like this for $800, folks, I would say do it. Now is the time. Again, if you wait a year, more and more people are going to start figuring out these are really good buys, and then the prices are going to go up. And even if they don't, just remember where we talked about inflation, and there's going to be an increasing number of people that just generally speaking are interested in Mosins. The prices, which is going to drive up the price of all Mosins, even if it doesn't specifically drive up the price of just Dragoon rifles. Now is not a bad time. Now, I'm not saying that if you have $800 and that's all you have and you need to use that to feed your family to go buy one of these, don't do that, right? But if you have $800 that you can use on an investment, or maybe there's something else that you can sell to make a little bit of money to go invest in, get one of these guys. You're not going to be disappointed. We can talk all day and all week and all year about the neat history of these particular rifles. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that, but we're trying to compact it all as best we can into Dragoon Week. So if you haven't already, go check out our other videos and stay tuned, because we'll have more videos coming out throughout the week here. So I appreciate y'all bearing with this very long-winded rant on Mosin Nagant prices and economics and Dragoon rifles, but I hope at least by now I've got your interest peaked in these rifles, and now is a great time to go buy one. So if you haven't already, go see if you can find one of these for sale out there, because you never know. Keep your eyes out, folks. If you like more videos like this, please consider subscribing. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.